Hello, and welcome to Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Thank you for joining us. My name is Elizabeth Caputo, and I am the chair of Manhattan Community Board 7. This is a neighborhood that encompasses the entire Upper West Side, which includes Lincoln Square, Manhattan Valley, in addition to other parts of the borough of Manhattan, but largely the entire Upper West Side. Today, we're here to talk about a number of issues related to housing on the Upper West Side, specifically the shared economy platform AirBnB. As many of you know, there has been recent legislation that has been signed by our governor related to AirBnB, and today we're going to spend some time talking about it with two guests. My guest today is Benjamin Howard Cooper, who is a lifetime Upper West Side resident. He is also a member of Community Board 7, and I just want to thank you for being here. And what I'd really like to start out with is getting your assessment of the neighborhood. The goal of us being here today is to talk about some things that are going on in the neighborhood related to housing, related to how Airbnb works or does not work. And as you know, a number of our elected officials have come out, I think the majority, if not all of them, have come out strongly opposed to the platform that Airbnb offers. So I would like to hear your perspective and perhaps have a conversation over the next 15 or 20 minutes about what we think could or could not work about these new vehicles and how we think it could promote what we all want, which is what we're confronting in this neighborhood now, which is a true crisis of affordable housing, which ultimately leads to members of our neighborhood leaving because they can't afford to stay here. So I'll start out with that and welcome and look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thanks for having me, Elizabeth. Yeah, I think we're touching on what's one of the most important issues facing the Upper West Side right now. It's becoming more and more expensive and prohibitive for Upper West Siders to stay in their homes, and the character of the neighborhood is changing. Alternatively, I think it's sticking your head in the sand to say that this neighborhood is only meant for neighborhood residents, that this isn't a tourist neighborhood. We have monuments that attract people from around the world. We have Lincoln Center, we have the Museum of Natural History, we have Central Park, Riverside Park. This is an incredible neighborhood that we should want to share with the world and not isolate ourselves off from. I don't think anybody is clamoring for a Hilton or a Marriott to come into the neighborhood. One of the charms of the Upper West Side is that it is residential in nature. And I think Airbnb really capitalizes on that. It enables people who want to come to New York and see the real New York to have that experience, to actually be in somebody's home and have that authentic New York experience, which I think the Upper West Side provides more so than pretty much any other neighborhood.
Great. So I want to bring up one of the things I've been reading, and I've read a lot over the last several years. I've been chair of Community Board 7 for 3 years now, and this perhaps touches on a nerve more than any others to me personally. I moved here in 1995 as a recent college graduate. I was not a quote-unquote true New Yorker, I guess, because I came from somewhere else. But I moved here, and at the time in the mid-90s, the Upper West Side was a place that sort of at all income levels, you could find, maybe you had a roommate, maybe you could find a place to live, and you were sort of fortunate to be a part of all that the Upper West Side has to offer, I think, to some of the points you raised earlier. Now, that seems to just be off the table. It's impossible for people to find places to live here if you're in sort of a middle-class environment. It's also hard to stay once you do find that place. So comments on that, and then I'd also like to touch upon an article that I just read from Bloomberg from a couple of weeks ago that talked about, and I thought it crystallized the argument very well, which said, I really do think, and I'm quoting here, I really do think enabling people to rent out their dwellings when they're not in them is a positive thing. There just happen to be two major complications in New York City. One is that New Yorkers live in buildings with lots of other New Yorkers, and the other is that New York doesn't have enough apartments for the people who want to live there, let alone visitors. So maybe if you could comment on both of those streams.
Well, I think to your point about the middle class being squeezed on the Upper West Side, certainly that is an issue, but I think it's naive to say that Airbnb is at fault. This has been an issue that stretches back to the 80s, and Airbnb was only founded in 2008. I think there are 40,000 units listed on Airbnb across the city, as opposed to the 2.5 million units of housing. Certainly Airbnb is having an effect on the way New Yorkers behave, but I don't see the link between Airbnb and increased rents. That is happening due to a whole bevy of economic forces that have very little to do with the sharing economy. As a matter of fact, I see it as being a tool for the middle class, like the Bloomberg article you cited. Rents are going up, and having that potential to have a little extra income here and there to make the rent goes a long way. There have been a whole list of studies that have shown that having that extra income enables New Yorkers to make that rent and stay in their neighborhoods and keep the community cohesive rather than having a neighborhood where only high wealth individuals can live. I think that really adds to the diversity of the neighborhood and keeps the Upper West Side a thriving and dynamic place.
Great. I think one of the things that people respond to when you make your comment, which I think is a valid one, about needing that little bit of extra income, is that actually keeps the rents high. So developers or landlords can think they can continue to charge the high rents, market rate rents that they do have on the Upper West Side. Do you have a response to that, or do you?
Those developers will charge those rents regardless, because the second that person leaves or gets pushed out, there's a line of 10 other people who are willing to move into that apartment and pay even more. The real goal should be to keep people in their apartments, which would keep rent down.
Got it. One of the things that I've also read a lot about is sort of the conflict in some of the people who have taken very distinct positions politically on this issue. And I purposely designed this session today to not have, and with our second guest, if he or she arrives, we wanted to have two residents and people who actually are not influenced by sort of lobbyists on either side of the issue. But what has been somewhat dispiriting to me has been seeing sort of the various lobbying causes who have really come forward and really pilloried things like Airbnb without trying to meet them at the table to negotiate a compromise. And specifically, I'm mentioning, the Hotel Trades Council, other elected officials who totally understood what they are trying to protect. And I think one of the things in this neighborhood that we clearly have seen, although we're trying to find more anecdotal evidence to support it, is exactly sort of the number of buildings, entire buildings that are being taken over by platforms like Airbnb. And so I understand how these lobbying groups, are upset about that. And I don't think any of us who are here today want that to be the norm on the Upper West Side. But to your earlier point, what we would like to see is a variety of people at different income levels being able to live in this neighborhood. And so I think, is there a way for our elected officials to work to try to increase affordability? And maybe if the rents weren't so high in the first place, I think in a perfect world, none of us would, maybe we wouldn't want Airbnb at all. We wouldn't need it because we would be able to afford to live in this neighborhood. Like, what's your response to that? Or do you?
I think that it just shows how clunky this law is, that it doesn't target large-scale warehousing and renting of apartments that qualify as an illegal hotel. It targets the whole range of users, the vast majority of which are using it casually. So if we wanted to target illegal hotels, then we should create a bill that targets illegal hotels. But what we have instead is something that targets an entire industry, an industry that has a direct threat on the hotel lobby. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the Assemblywoman and the Senator who sponsored the bill are very much entrenched with the hotel lobby. This is not a bill that protects New Yorkers. This is a bill that protects the hotel industry, which is just very much crystallized by the fact that the day after this bill was signed, the CEO of LaSalle Properties, a number of different hotel executives came out and said, this is great, this is a big boost in the arm for our business. Well, bills should not be designed to support the hotel lobby. They should be designed to protect New Yorkers, and that's not what this bill did.
Got it. This is probably a good time to reference what I should have said at the beginning, which is the fact that I am the chair of Community Board 7 and Benjamin is a member. We are speaking here today as residents of the Upper West Side. I'm moderating a discussion. I think Benjamin is speaking in his capacity as a New Yorker and as an Upper West Side resident. We have had discussions within the Community Board about the shared economy. And our hope is that part of the reason we're doing this taping today is so that we can get more people to come out to our meetings at Community Board 7. Towards the end of our discussion, I'll provide more information about all that we do. But we really do want to have more community input. And I think until we have that, there are a lot of voices in our neighborhood who are using Airbnb, who maybe don't know or not using it or are really upset by it. And they don't know that a community board exists and they haven't come to voice their opinions. And so what we hear is really just one side of a story that I think is actually a lot more complex. And again, to be clear, Community Board 7 has taken no position other than, I think, having concerns about illegal hotels, which I think we are all concerned about on the Upper West Side and opposed to, because they are somewhat prolific in the neighborhood, and we would like for people to have sort of a fair chance at getting housing here. I guess maybe to talk about the legislation as it changed from 2010, if you could maybe provide a word or two on that, and sort of how a lot of people have said, well, what's happening with what the governor signed is not, it's changing slightly, but it's been existing. The concern about illegal hotels has been going on far before Airbnb even came on the scene in the 2011, 2012. So maybe could we spend a minute talking about that?
So the 2010 law specifies that it is illegal to provide short-term rentals in Class A multiple dwellings. The new law that was just signed this past week indicates not only that it is illegal to rent them, but it is also illegal to advertise them. And in addition to that, specifies the fines that are associated with illegally renting out your apartment. So it's not that this is something new, it's just that we're sort of formalizing something that had already existed, and we're starting to talk a little bit more about enforcement. And what I find really troubling is that the legislators who designed the bill have come out and said that no way is this bill designed to target the casual users, the middle-class user who's going away on vacation for a week and just wants to supplement that income. They're saying that they're only targeting the illegal hotels. Well, then why not develop a law that targets the illegal hotels? Why would you create such a wide-sweeping law and then create an enforcement policy that doesn't actually target the majority of the users? That, to me, just seems like lazy legislation that puts New Yorkers at risk.
Right. So what would be the alternative? Like, what could be something that we do in the legislature or elsewhere to try to forge, I think what people see and people recognize on the Upper West Side is these new technologies, whether it's Uber or Airbnb, and depending on what you read, some of the technologies work and some of them don't in a place like New York City. What can be done to try to bring sides to the table so that there's an understanding that I think everyone agrees that having platforms like these shared economy vehicles like Airbnb cannot exist in a place like New York without them being completely taxed, completely regulated, playing by the same rules as other as a hotel would, if not more stringent regulation. What can be done to try to bring? It seems like now there is really the government is on one side taking a stance, and then the business side, the Airbnb, the company, and they're not willing to meet together to try to negotiate a compromise. And in the example of San Francisco, where there was a compromise that was negotiated, that's now completely fallen apart. So is it just a situation where there's just the minds aren't going to come to the table and it's not going to work? Because I feel like the technologies, it's sort of like, on the one hand, it's stifling innovation, and these technologies are going to come across the pipeline, and I realize that what happens in Omaha is not what happens on the Upper West Side of New York, and you can't apply the same rules to two different cities or two different regions of the US at the same time, but surely there would have to be a way to encourage sort of this new technology, but also making sure that it remains a level playing field in a place like the Upper West Side.
Well, and it's our civic leaders' duties to figure out how to bring all of the stakeholders to the table, to create a policy that is responsive to the needs of New Yorkers that protects them as well. And so that means bringing the hotel lobby to the table, bringing Airbnb to the table, bringing residents to the table, not creating a law that essentially illegalizes an entire industry, because that's sticking our head in the sand. The sharing economy is here to stay. So it is in the best interest of New Yorkers, and it is the responsibility of our elected officials to figure out how to work with these industries in the most effective and efficient way possible. So that means creating a hotel tax for Airbnb. Airbnb has come out and said that they would voluntarily provide a tax to the city that could provide upwards of $90 million a year. $90 million a year for our budget that continues to grow exponentially while our revenues are starting to decline. For the first time in 5 years, we're starting to lose money in the city coffers. So this is an opportunity to fill some of those budget holes and be creative and figure out how to position New York for the next generation. Because Airbnb isn't going away. Uber is not going away. The sharing economy is a very real part of this economy, and we need to figure out how to protect New Yorkers and also encourage this sort of technological development. We need to figure out how to encourage business growth, not stifle it. And I do think that that means inviting some sorts of regulation, which Airbnb, again, has offered to do under their own volition. Prior to this bill coming out, they offered to kick everyone off of the site who had more than 3 violations, to remove the illegal hotels. As a matter of fact, they removed 3,000 users right before this bill was signed. It shows that they are willing to cooperate and work with our electeds. But what we see on the other side of the table is that they are being manipulated, or at least led by the hotel lobby, and they are just not willing to come to the table because compromise isn't in their interests.
Got it. One of the things that's come up at the community board level has been a lot of residents in the neighborhood, board members in particular, are very concerned about sort of the overall sort of safety issues. And to be frank, that is something that, to me, I hadn't thought about until I thought about the buildings I've lived in as a renter on the Upper West Side over the years, and thinking, do you want to give your keys, to a stranger, even if it's just for a weekend? And how could that, would require such a level of regulation and scrutiny that could it actually be done? Like, could it happen on the Upper West Side? And then, as we were talking before the show began, you brought up the issue of sort of a nanny or somebody who comes in to walk a dog. Like somebody, and a nanny I think is probably the better example because they're in the apartment for multiple hours during the day, sometimes overnight. Why is there such, do you think, in the public right now, such sort of recalcitrance and incalcitrance about the Airbnb model and having strangers come in versus having somebody who, and it may not even be a stranger, it may be somebody who's been vetted, it may be a friend who's paying the money to stay for a few days, versus other people who are in that apartment during certain hours during the day?
Well, I think that a lot of it has to do with this being a new platform, a new way of operating. And so obviously there's going to be some pushback in the beginning. Nannies and dog walkers have been a facet of life on the Upper West Side for decades. And having this sort
and they know the owners.
Exactly, they know the owners.
Exactly,
sure.
So.
But to that point, one of the very facets of living on the Upper West Side or living in any urban center is that there is a transient nature to it. We have FedEx men, we have food delivery guys, we have dog walkers, we have nannies. People are constantly coming in and out of buildings. So if that's something that makes you uncomfortable, I would question whether or not living in an urban center is right for you. That you are subjecting yourself to a certain level of just unknown people and just movement. And that's, I think, what adds a vibrancy to New York. And I think certainly a lot of millennials would agree that they encourage that sort of movement, that they like that. Certainly there are security risks, but those same security risks exist in buildings with or without Airbnb. And Airbnb comes with insurance policies, and they are talking about doing extra levels of vetting, and there are opportunities to select hosts that are who've only received background checks. And so I think that is an indication that Airbnb is really wanting to work with the community to figure out how to make their platform work for us, rather than what we're seeing from the other side of the table, which is a lot of pushback and not a lot of compromise, which doesn't serve anybody. And to the point of a building not wanting to have that same transient nature to it, well, to that I would say encourage your co-op board to sign a policy that would prevent this sort of renting out. I don't think that this needs to be a blanket policy, and I truly believe that it should be handled on a building-by-building basis. The majority of
or a city-by-city basis in the case of how certain cities work. If you own a home in a rural part of the country where you rent out your house for a weekend, if there's something that's different than doing it here in New York.
Absolutely.
So, and I think again, what I'd like to spend a couple minutes talking about, especially since our colleagues may not be able to join us today, is really looking at the other side of the coin. And one thing that Community Board 7 has been very actively working to try to assist, which is our neighbors who are being affected by the rise of sort of what we call the illegal hotels. And they are prevalent on the Upper West Side. There are entire buildings that are being taken over. There's the SRO issue. What I think complicates the situation, and in my conversations with that constituency prior to this conversation today, was really that it's not just to them, Airbnb is not who's at fault. It's that they amplify because they have so much money and they're so well funded, and they have all these lobbying groups who come in and pour money into advertisements to make them seem like they're this great saving grace for the neighborhood. But then you have entire buildings that are being taken over as illegal hotels. They may or may not be done by Airbnb. I think leaving Airbnb off the table for this part of the conversation, what can we do as a neighborhood to protect the rights of tenants who have lived in this neighborhood for decades, some of them, and are being subject to the whims of developers who are, really running operations in their buildings as illegal hotels?
Well, we really need our community residents to report when they see things that are going on that they find to be illegal. Residents know when we have illegal hotels in our neighborhoods, and it is on us to call 311 and call our elected officials and make sure it is known that these illegal hotels are operating in our community. And that should be the first target. I actually find that Airbnb can be a solution to this because they've offered to go into their sites and identify commercial users. Before, the illegal hotel space was operating in a much more diffuse manner. It was hard to sort of concentrate on where you would find those sorts of listings. And here we have a great opportunity to find an aggregation of all of these illegal hotels and really target them in a concerted effort, whereas before it would have been much more difficult.
So I think the data piece I think is really important. One of the things I've really struggled with as chair of the board for the last 3 years has been sort of where can we go to find an objective set of data? Like where can we see in our neighborhood, and our hope, and I know the Borough President's Office is working very hard on this, is to try to find sort of a neutral, objective source of data about where these illegal hotels are operating, rather than having Airbnb present us sort of a bleached set of data that we know isn't probably accurate. And at the same time, other lobbying groups presenting a separate set of data. So I think one of the things we'd love to get out of this conversation today is hoping that our city government can work with us as a community to try to provide that information. And then once we have it, I think our community board is very interested in really trying to protect the rights of these tenants. As much as we care about sort of new technologies, we also deeply care about what is happening in the neighborhood with the rise of the illegal hotels. So, but the data piece clearly seems to me to be a sticking point because we've had many arguments at our community board meetings about, where'd you get the data from, or it's from this organization or this organization, and there's no real central place to go to get it. And I think that would be a good starting point for us to really identify, to really be able to gauge, like, how big of a problem, is the Airbnb issue the issue? Is it the illegal hotel issue that is the issue? Is it a combination of both? Like, who's actually using these places and whatnot? So that's, I think, just to transition into more of a conversation about the community board. You've been a resident here. I think you were born in the neighborhood. So you've seen this neighborhood sort of evolve. I would love to hear just from your experience in the last 20, 30, 20 some years that you've been around, sort of how you've seen housing and sort of the situations on the Upper West Side have evolved from the time you were young and growing up here.
Sure, and I think that's, to start, I think the borough president has been an incredible pioneer in the space of open data. So she's been actively working to create a portal where all of the billions of data points that the city collects on a daily basis are aggregated. And that's a great opportunity for us to truly study the effects of a whole range of policies, not just Airbnb. So I think, moving forward, as those open data portals continue to become more robust, as we get more and more data points in there, that's a great opportunity for not only CB7, but every community board across the city to really use data-backed decision-making and not just respond to policies in a knee-jerk manner and get worked up by emotions and be able to be manipulated by certain moneyed interests. I think we should be always following the data, and kudos to the Borough President's Office for being a pioneer on that. On housing on the Upper West Side, when I first came, it was not the neighborhood that it is now. I live on West End Avenue, right across from the Trump Towers. That complex was not there. I certainly think the Upper West Side used to be a homier neighborhood. It used to be much less transient. We certainly see people who stay for 2 or 3 years and then they move. But they're moving because they can no longer afford to stay here. The new housing stock is so expensive, and it continues to rise at such an exponential rate that the community is no longer able to anchor themselves there, that they're constantly looking for another place to live just to make ends meet.
Got it. No, I think that's a really important point. And from my own experience from having moved here in 1995, I noticed a neighborhood that was a place where people moved here, as recent graduates or their first jobs, or people who even had lived here for a long time, and they stayed. And I think what we're seeing more and more in the neighborhood, for a variety of reasons, is people who just can't, I think we're blessed by a lot of transit options. We're blessed by amazing cultural facilities and institutions. There's so much to offer on the Upper West Side, but the sheer fact remains that being able to afford to live in the neighborhood remains one of the big prohibitors of people actually staying. And as a result of that, the neighborhood has become a little bit more divided. And it's seen in what's going on now with issues related to school equity with the public schools. It's seen in a lot of the zoning issues and so forth. And our hope, and I think what we, part of the reason that you and I both joined Community Board 7 was really to try to show that there are representatives of the neighborhood who represent sort of all walks of life. And I think the board continues to be a place where we represent a number of really important issues on the Upper West Side. Related to housing, we've established a public housing task force, which I believe is the first of its kind from within any of the community boards. I think sometimes people forget it's nice for us to be here talking about sort of shared economy and affordable housing, but people forget that the Upper West Side also has very vibrant, strong communities that are represented by Frederick Douglass houses and Wise Towers and Amsterdam houses, and those developments and neighborhoods are critically important to the Upper West Side as well. So, clearly there are a lot of complicating and complex and really interesting issues related to housing. I guess just as a final wrap up for you, Benjamin, is there anything that you feel just in general, let's think about what this neighborhood is going to look like 20 years from now. Do you see the Airbnb or the shared economy model sort of being a viable part of the Upper West Side? Do you see the illegal housing, or the illegal hotel issue going away? What would you envision sort of the Upper West Side looking like in 20 years? I
think ideally what we would find is that Airbnb, our elected officials, and the hotel lobby come together and create a policy that works for the Upper West Side. And I do think that can happen, and it will happen. It might take a little bit of time, but I think to meet the needs and interests of all New Yorkers, and specifically Upper West Siders, our elected officials need to be able to take that on and bring that to the table. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Again, we had hoped to have a couple of different voices here today, but I think you've given a very good overview of what's going on in our neighborhood, and I really appreciate you being here. Just a quick reminder, Community Board 7, we have a Twitter handle. It is @CB7 Manhattan. We would like for you to join us, whether you're an Upper West Sider or not. We hope you'll follow us and get involved. Our meetings, our full board meetings, are the first Tuesday of every month in various locations around the Upper West Side. And we look forward to continuing to present on these issues that represent NYC. So with that in mind, again, this is Elizabeth Caputo. I'd like to thank you for joining me on this edition of Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Goodbye.